Well, welcome to the first of our caption lectures for this year. Always a moment of uncertainty for me to see how many people will turn up, and I'm gratified to see the size of our audience this evening. Most of clergy, many clergy, have done something else before they took the yoke of obedience upon them, except yours truly, who went in from certain university. But this evening's guest hasn't just been a dancer for briefly, but was for a decade, and also a choreographer with the Royal New Zealand Ballet, and now is on its board. So he has come with the most remarkable background to ministry, and is now a chaplain at Cathedral Grammar in Christchurch Diocese. What a remarkable family he comes from. His father took St John's Lateran Square, a middling-sized evangelical congregation, and built it up in one of the biggest parishes in the Diocese of Christchurch. Your brother Alex, if you listened into Radio New Zealand on Saturday afternoon, introduces us all to the delights of contemporary music. And your brother Jay, the vicar of St Stephen Shirley, has become a major player in provincial affairs. And so you now embark upon this new career, and you tell me earlier this evening you've been worked in a call centre, you've been an IT programmer as well. So this is a new field of endeavour. We look forward very much to your lecture, which will be lavishly illustrated with slides and movie clips, and look forward to enjoying it thoroughly. Jay.
Thank you,
Tony.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to come down from Christchurch today and to have the chance to speak to you. Let me start by right at the beginning. 1985 it was in Nelson Intermediate School actually. I was standing there with a few other kids. There weren't many. I don't know if any of you have heard of the open air campaigners at all. Some of you may have a way back. I was standing with a few kids at lunchtime, open air campaigners, and there was a race on, so I was kind of getting my game face on with about the 4 others. We were in the finals of something known as the sword drill. You had to find a particular verse from the Bible. Now, it was new to me. All I could see was down the end of the hall. I knew my target there was a balloon. In that balloon was a verse of scripture. I had to blow up the balloon, pop it, get the piece of paper out, find the verse in the Bible, etc., and I would have won the final. I got through the preliminaries. This was the final. So I took off down there, and I think we all reached the balloons at pretty much the same stage. I popped mine quite early. It had baffled me in the preliminaries why people bothered looking for the chapter and verse in the Bible. No one else had seemed to notice that the page number of the Bible was written at the bottom. You saw this, so I just zoomed straight for the page number and got there first of all. I won the prize, which was the Bible, my first ever Bible. Our family had been going to church, for maybe a year or so by that stage, but it hadn't touched me personally at all. So I won my first Bible, but more importantly, that day in 1985, when the Open Air Campaigners talked, was the day that I became a Christian. And so I was making a choice on that day, which was going to put me in the minority of my friends, really. Some people knew that I went to church, that they'd kind of cottoned on that our family was going out in Atawhai in Nelson, and things like that, so they used to probably tease me a bit about that. But that was something that I was used to, being teased, because being in the minority for believing in God was just another minority that I was in. You see, for about 4 or 5 years by that stage, I had been doing ballet. And it's not an easy ride if you're a boy at that time doing ballet. My mother and I differ as to how I started off in the ballet world. Mum thinks I came up with the idea out of the blue, but I can remember very clearly when I was 5 years old, I had a conversation with my mother where she asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I said, I don't know. I think a lot of 5-year-olds don't know. My mum's quite pushy, quite persistent. So she said, well, come on, Toby, would you want to be a fireman or a policeman or a ballet dancer? And I thought she was giving me 3 options. You've got to be careful, don't you, when you speak to a 5-year-old. I thought she was giving me the options I could choose from. I didn't want to be a fireman. I didn't want to be a policeman. They didn't sound appealing at all. So I thought my lot in life was going to be ballet. And from my perspective, I needed, if that was going to be my job, I needed to learn how to do it. So we both agree, Mother and I, that I started asking and pestering her about doing ballet, and eventually she conceded and bought me a second-hand pair of ballet shoes, etc. And I started doing ballet. I think this is probably roughly what I would have looked like at the time. I think that young girl's name is Francine, if I remember rightly. And as soon as I got in the theatre, I mean, there's one thing when you take your first ballet lesson. I remember going into a church hall, much like this one through here, and I was the only boy. Every girl's head kind of swiveled to look at this person walking, and I had my little black shorts on and a white t-shirt and things like that. No one wanted to dance with me at the time when you had to pair up and partner up and that kind of thing. But maybe take it or leave it. When I first started doing the dance, I wasn't quite sure about the ballet thing itself. But once I got in the theatre, it was just another world. I loved the theatre. And so from here on in, I absolutely loved it. So really, at that stage in Nelson early on, 2 things, which are the most influential things in my life, apart from people. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening, really. Number 1 was that decision to be a ballet dancer when I was 5. Number 2, 1985, becoming a Christian, putting my faith, my personal trust in God as well. And those 2 factors have been present ever since in my life. And it's been very interesting kind of preparing the material for talking to you this evening, going and having a look back at how they've kind of interwoven through my life. It's they've been a constant presence. So I don't speak to you tonight all about me as a story about Toby Behan, because none of you will know Toby Behan, but it's very interesting to me from a point of faith. So if any part of my own journey, which I speak about tonight, encourages you and your faith or anything like that, then that's really what I'm looking for, because there are points of commonality between, for all of us as we walk in faith, and we all have varied lives. As Hugh said before, when we've done a lot of different things in our life. Ballet was just my particular one. So I like to start by just talking about my teenage years. I guess I followed my father around. Hugh mentioned my dad, Wally Behan. What a name, Wally. Have to get a bit of stick from that, as well as doing ballet when I was a kid. But we followed Dad around. Dad was training to become a minister. So after our time in Nelson, Dad became a Christian totally separately from me, and we went up to Auckland, where Dad did 2 years at Bible College, and then over the other side of Auckland went to St John's College as well. And so we would just kind of follow around and did our own kind of thing. And while my ballet lessons were carrying on, it was a lovely time for me in faith. I kind of joined the youth group, whichever church we were placed in at the time. I remember having camps on islands in Hauraki Gulf, somewhere like that, Christian camps, which were a huge benefit to me. I remember being really joyous and just very secure, knowing that God had his face turned towards me. I just felt something very personal and very joyous, very simple in my relationship with God at that time. But it was another world from the more secular world. So when I went to school, for example, the language that's used in a youth group and at church was very, very different from the language that's used at school. And the conversations I had with my friends, very, very different. So I was the only Christian amongst my friends, and I used to get a very hard time and get seriously challenged by my friends who were into, science and things like that. I remember my friend grilling me on why we had an appendix, and I had no answer for it. He had some fancy thing about a dolphin and appendix, and I had no answer at all for him. But what that left me with was just this vague sense of unease. I felt a little bit uneasy because the two areas, the secular and my world of faith, seemed very separate. And my faith, to be honest, at that time felt quite fragile. I felt that if it was subjected to a little bit more scrutiny, in other words, if my friend asked me any more searching questions, it wouldn't hold up. That was really how I felt about my faith at the time. Dad was placed in Christchurch. I won't go into the details of exactly how that came about, but we moved down to Christchurch where Dad took curacy at St Timothy's Church, which is in the parish of Burnside there. And in that year of, it was 1990, I was at Southern Ballet with a man called Russell Kerr up there as well. And Russell Kerr was a fantastic teacher who added to the training I'd already received. Russell started pushing me in the direction of the New Zealand School of Dance, and that would have been a big step. I'm one of 4 boys, and at that stage no one had left home, so it was a big step for one of the boys to kind of leave. I did. I was the first to leave home. I remember painfully the night that Dad prayed for me. He cried. That's the first time I'd ever seen my dad cry, and it broke my heart. But I was nevertheless very excited to go to Wellington, which I did at the beginning of 1991. I started full-time training at the New Zealand School of Dance, which at that time was a 2-year course that you did. And really that's a period in my life. I was, 16, 17 at the time. It's probably where faith and dance started clashing a little bit. Up until then, I had a relatively good upbringing, and I knew my relationship with God. I was solid. I had ideas of what I wanted to end up like. But then the world of full-time dance pulled me away from it in some ways. Not to put too fine a point on it, it starts with a fairly basic observation. Dance is a very physical pastime, whatever you call it. You get very used to one another's bodies, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak inappropriately here, but that was what was going on with me at that time. Suddenly I was being, I was gone from an environment where I hadn't had any relationships with anyone to where I was partnering someone full-time every day, or, this, that and the other thing. And so one thing led to another, and I had this newfound freedom. And what I found was that I didn't live up to the ideals that I had put in place for myself. I had this very chaste idea of what I was going to do in terms of marriage, and I was never going to sleep with anyone before I got married or anything like that. All these ideals that I had, but when I was at the School of Dance, that clashed, and I found myself in a relationship with a couple of girls there, and it kind of destroyed me in a little way, because how can you be destroyed in a little way? The certain image that I had of myself was shattered at that time. The image that I had, I certainly didn't live up to it. And while I didn't walk around despondently, there was a deep-seated sense of disappointment in myself that I wasn't what I thought I was going to be. And I remember again, that was where I had my first big disagreement with Dad. Dad knew what was going on with me. Dad, who I'd speak to on the phone, both Mum and Dad, regularly, he told me to come home. He said, "Toby, this isn't you. Come home." And I said, "No, Dad." And he said, "Toby, I'm your father. I'm telling you, this is not good for you. You need to come home." And I remember I said to him, "Dad, this is my life. I can do with it what I want. This is what I want to do." I'm still ashamed of doing that, but it is what I did. And I stayed at the New Zealand School of Dance. I think that's roughly how I was looking at that stage. I call that the lift that I could do. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment when I joined the ballet company. So at the New Zealand School of Dance, you could be in one of 2 streams. You could either be studying classical dance or contemporary dance. I wanted to be in the Royal New Zealand Ballet, so I was in the classical stream, which is where most people were. There was only about 2 people, I think, in the contemporary dance stream, which put 16 of us in competition for 3 scholarships, which were given to enter the Royal New Zealand Ballet. So the competition was, pretty intense. And in the first year, I remember we're all friends, we're all getting along very well. In the second year, the competition kicked in and things got competitive, and suddenly your friends weren't your friends anymore, kind of thing. So I was one of 4 boys, and I was the weakest, the smallest of them all. Essentially, perhaps technically I might have been tidier than some of the others, but the thing I had going against me was I couldn't, I had no strength, put it that way. So normally, you know, lifts are over your head kind of thing. I had no hope of doing any of these lifts where the girls went over my head. I didn't have the physical development that other boys did. And so really, I didn't count myself in the running to get any of these scholarships. There was a top one, the Shell 1 scholarship, and there were 2 level 2 scholarships. The top one was a full year, and then the other 2 were part-time. And I do remember towards the end of my second year that one of the teachers, Don McLeod his name was, he was exiting the building and he said to me, "Do you have a passport, Toby?" And I thought, that's a bizarre thing to ask. And I said, "No." He said, "Oh, maybe want to get one." And then I started putting 2 and 2 together, and I thought, you know, the company's down to do an international tour next year. I wonder if he's trying to tell me something. But I didn't dare to hope or believe it. But it was the next week when they announced the Shell scholarships. My name was read out when they announced the Shell 1 scholarship. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. It was, you know, no one expected me to get it at all. And then actually it was this girl here, Raven, who just said, "Yeah," afterwards. And finally, when people clapped, I realised, well, maybe they still were my friends and weren't all that kind of thing. But in that time of my life, I think it's fair to say that faith was probably the more fragile of the 2 forces. Between faith and dance, faith was the one that was really under pressure at that time. And like I said, I look back on some things and some of the ways I behaved. I'm really disappointed in them now, but we often make that many mistakes in youth. There's a verse from Isaiah which, only looking back on it now, comes to mind. It says, "A bruised reed he will never break." Speaking about God, of course, speaking about, I think, Jesus, a bruised reed he will never break. And I think of myself in those years as something of a bruised reed, and I'm very grateful that God didn't, in fact, break me. So, the Shell Scholarship led to me being in the Royal New Zealand Ballet for a year. That was a dream realised. I was being paid for the first time in my life. None of this student allowance stuff. I was getting, I think it was $180 a week maybe. But it was massive. You know, I could pay for my own flat and suddenly I was in the company. The first thing we did was we toured to America. So I had, I think, about 5 weeks to learn 3 full-time ballets. We learned Mozart, which was a full-length ballet, Capella, which is a fairly standard classical ballet, and then a triple bill of 3 works as well. So we learnt those in very quick succession, and then we took them to the more of the east coast of the States, where for 2.5 months we travelled around, and that was just a terrific time. It was a blur. America was a blur. It was really punishing schedule. We'd sometimes be doing 8 performances in 7 days. You know, you'd literally get into the bus and you know, from your hotel in the morning, drive to the theatre, and you've got to do your placing call where you space out the ballet on the stage. Some of these audiences were 6,000 people at a time, you know, big theatres in the universities and things, and in New York, even bigger than that. But, you know, you really only got time to warm up, do your performance as well, and then try and find something somewhere to eat, and then you're back to the hotel and on a bus, travel 2 hours to the next place the next morning. So it was a real whirlwind tour all the way through. But I did find that as I started to go on tour, that, and I look back and I thank God so much for that, that was where my relationship with God often was advanced. I found in my life that God dealt with me an awful lot more when I was on my own than when I was kind of in a church setting in some ways. So, you know, the private devotions that I would have or something like that, God would deal with me in a very special way. And on tour, I was alone a lot. Not just on my own, but I was the only Christian in the ballet company as well. And that was, you know, difficult. I didn't have anyone I could speak to about my faith either. And so those times where God would strengthen me on my own were very, very valuable. In Wellington, it was a bit difficult to find a place to go to church, and quite often I just wouldn't go. I was simply too tired. I wasn't very disciplined with my church going. I was helped a great deal by a man called William Southgate. Has anyone heard of Sir William Southgate? Terrific. Yeah, wonderful guy, Willie. He was, him and his wife Rosemary used to take me under their wing somewhat, and I met him because obviously the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra would often play for the ballet company, and Sir William conducted. He was an extraordinary conductor and composer actually, and a solid Christian guy as well. So they would often take me out to church and things like that, which I was very grateful for. There's a number of people like that which God very graciously put in my life to kind of nurture faith when I was at a weaker stage. And so William was a great help to me at the time. I learnt through him that there was actually a group of Christians in the symphony orchestra at the time, and I remember thinking, well, why aren't there any at all in the ballet company? But there was a group in the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra who used to meet before every performance, and they'd pray for 20 minutes, half an hour before their performances, and I thought, gee, that's terrific, you know. Where was that with dance? And actually I'm going to speak a little bit more about that later on, because that is something that I think is worth us reflecting on a little bit, or thinking about Christians and the arts, and why perhaps are they not more visibly. I can't speak knowledgeably about other sectors, but I can speak knowledgeably about dance. And since I left the ballet company myself, I'm aware of one other person who's been a Christian in the ballet company, and that's it. So it does bear some thinking about. I think I've got right, there's me in the ballet company. When I joined, the other thing which is probably worth mentioning too when I was in the ballet company, this was between 1993 and 1996, was that I had an episode of depression which took me away from the company for a few months. I didn't know what was happening. My mother, who had suffered depression, did, and all I knew was that I was basically just breaking down into tears an awful lot. It was, you know, little things just seemed absolutely huge to me. And my mother recognised what was happening and told the company, and I had to leave and come back home to Christchurch for a while, where I saw a psychiatrist who explained to me what was going on. And at the time, it sounded a bit odd to me, depression. I thought, well, that's not is that a real thing? That's just a weakness thing or something like that. But the psychiatrist explained it very helpfully to me. And I got worse before I got better. They told me I would, but I remember I just couldn't, get up sometimes in the morning. Or the classic thing that illustrates it to me was one evening after dinner, I decided that I was going to do something. I was sick of being this just lifeless kind of person, so I thought I'd clear the table. That seems like a reasonable thing to do after sandwiches, so I started clearing away after dinner, and I put the tomatoes away, and the bread and things like that. And I looked at the boiled eggs and I thought, they need to go in the fridge. And then I thought, actually no, Dad might want to have one a little bit later on, so I'll put them on the oven. And I thought, no, actually I'll just put some glad wrap on them, and then I lost it. And then half an hour later, Mum finds me weeping on the kitchen table because I couldn't decide what to do with these boiled eggs. And that's the thing. Depression has kind of come a little bit back with me in my life every now and then. It's more like a familiar kind of thing now. I recognise the symptoms when it's there, but it's such a terrible thing, a weight. It stops me being me when it's on. I've never had to go on medication again since that first episode, but it was very difficult coming back to the company after that too. Some were aware that I'd had depression, others weren't, and I really felt like I'd lost ground, which is an important thing in the ballet company, because you're often riding a wave of momentum when it comes to getting particular roles. Roles is what it's all about when you're in the ballet company, what you're getting and what you're not getting. And I kind of did two stints with the Royal New Zealand Ballet. The first was between 93 and 96, and I was rather young and proud at that stage, and by the time it got to 1996, I was quite disappointed that I wasn't getting the roles that I thought I deserved. I looked at some other people who were my age or who'd been there for the same amount of time, and I thought, well, you're getting roles and I'm not, kind of thing, and I was a bit upset about that. But the other thing which was happening for me at the time was I was getting very interested in choreography. We'd often do choreographic workshops where we'd get to create works ourselves, and at that stage I wasn't doing anything big or connected. I was really doing abstract little works, trying to work out some things about movement, just small pieces that would show in workshop settings. So I was getting very interested in that. And then in 1996, towards the end of it, I got an offer from Southern Ballet out of the blue. And Southern Ballet is a small regional company in Christchurch, and they were looking for someone to basically be their resident choreographer, someone to come down and choreograph works full time. And in my, I think, pride, thinking I'm not getting what I deserve here at the ballet company, I can't believe I was thinking that, but also the fact that I had this growing interest in choreography, I thought I would head back to Christchurch, and I did, to take up the position as resident choreographer down in Christchurch. I think I've got a picture of, here we go. That's my wife, by the way, Prue. I'll talk a little bit more about her in a moment. in a moment, because Prue was at Southern Ballet when I went down there, but Southern Ballet was an incredible opportunity. Being a smaller company, I had to do all the things which had been done for me in the Royal New Zealand Ballet. So there I just had, up in the ballet company, you just pretty much walk on stage and you just do what you do. But at Southern Ballet, if I'm involved in a position, in a performance, as resident choreographer there, I had to patch the lighting. I had to literally plug in the lighting cables, work out what the lighting cues were going to be. I had some help, but it was a great opportunity to really learn the craft from the ground up. Why costume design happens the way that it does, the thinking that goes behind the construction of the scenic elements and all of that kind of thing. So it was a great opportunity for me to really learn the mechanics of choreography and to experiment. I mean, I was doing producing or creating 7 full-length works in a year at Southern Ballet, which is unprecedented. If I was a choreographer in the ballet company, for example, I might do one every 3 or 4 years or something like that, and only have a certain amount of control. But at Southern, to get that opportunity was just gold, and so I learned so much about what worked and what didn't work from an audience perspective, because I was always fascinated with the audience perspective, not so much the kind of highbrow art thing, but what worked, why people liked some stories or others. And I think Russell Kerr was a big part of that. Being my teacher, he was someone who was wonderfully skilled at narrative ballets, at telling a story. He was very dramatic. And so Russell was a kind of mentor to me an awful lot in that year. Even though he wasn't at Southern Ballet himself, I'd always go and visit him in New Brighton and talk through the work that I was doing, and he'd kind of coach me through it and things like that. So Southern was just absolutely terrific. And that choreographic development gave me my first opportunity to choreograph in the ballet company as well. So I got Mark Skoog was the director at the time, so when I was in Christchurch, he offered me the chance to choreograph for the nationwide tour, which is a smaller tour that the ballet company does, where they don't just go to the major theatres, they go to the smaller towns. And it's a great chance to trial new choreographers, so he gave me the opportunity to do something. This is just some photos from Southern Ballet here, not related to what I'm talking about at the moment. The work that I did for the Royal New Zealand Ballet, my first one, was called Clueless. It was a kind of a play on the Cluedo, the board game Cluedo, with all the characters and the mysteries and things like that. It's a 15-minute comedy. It used a lot of the lessons that I learnt from Southern Ballet, and I still really enjoy looking back on that piece now. It's very zany, kind of funny take-off murder. Colonel Mustard was the murderer for me. He was always the most psychopathic of the Cluedo characters in my view, and things like that. Let me see. Yeah. In the meantime, though, so all that stuff was going on choreographically. In the meantime, I think the real benefit that was going on for me underneath was really faith-wise, because I'd come home to Christchurch, and Dad by that stage was established at the church you mentioned before. That's St John's, Latimer Square, so that's where the transitional cathedral is now. For those of you who know Christchurch, it's in the centre of the city. And it was great there because it started to address some of the unease that I had about faith. I mentioned that my faith had been quite fragile and I didn't feel like it would be able to stand up to much scrutiny, that kind of thing. Dad was a really good preacher. Dad wasn't, and still is, Dad's not an academic, so he came from a very working class background in Warrington, in England, but he had a great gift at explaining things very simply. And as I sat in church kind of Sunday after Sunday, and I heard a verse which I thought, well, how's that going to stand up? Does that really make any sense? Dad had an ability to kind of explain in a really simple and everyday way that particular verse and show me how real it was. And God really used Dad greatly in my life there in terms of faith, because I understood and began to say, actually, yeah, it does stand up to a little bit of thinking. I don't need to switch my brain off in order to have faith in God. And this document, the Bible that we look at each week, isn't something that you just can't ask questions about. You can. You can ask it those serious questions, and it does have answers to give. My brother had arrived back from a year which he'd spent training in Cornhill in the UK as well, and he'd started some Bible study groups in the church, and so it was in the phase of growing. Again, Hugh mentioned that it did become this big church. This is in the phase as it was growing. These Bible study groups, I'd go along and listen to my brother teach too. Same kind of thing. I think, gee, that makes a lot of sense. And it became more real to me. And so I was getting more grounded, I think, in my faith at the same time as this stuff was going on at Southern Ballet. And of course, the other thing I did mention before was Prue. Prue was in Southern Ballet, probably the one area where I still wasn't very good with my faith was when it came to relationships. I kind of understood, and don't worry, I'm not going to start speaking about biblical rights or wrongs about dating someone who's not a Christian, but from a simplistic point of view, if you're in a relationship with someone with a totally different worldview, it doesn't work. Not generally. But this isn't a lesson that I learnt very easily. I kept dating people who had completely different views of the world other than my own. Prue was no exception. Prue was not a Christian when I started dating her. She was in the ballet company, and I kind of fancied her an awful lot, really. And the thing is, if you're a choreographer, you have certain advantages. I was in charge of the company, so I just happened to create a dance for Prue and I where we were in love. And that dance just happened to have a kiss in it. I just put a kiss in it. I thought it was right for the occasion, so I put that in there and things. Actually, that backfired slightly because we never actually performed a kiss in rehearsal. So we'd always kind of do all the movements up to the kiss, and then I'll say, yep, that's fine, then we'll just start from now. Do it. But eventually, we were only about 3-4 days out from performance, and I said, look, we'll run the whole thing. We've got to run the whole thing right through this time. So we set the music to going, and then my mother comes in the door to check out the rehearsal and have a look. So I don't know how many people can say the first time they ever kissed their partner was in front of their mother, but I did say that, and it was nothing spectacular, unfortunately. But Prue started. She was fascinated in when I started talking about God. I didn't kind of overtly evangelise Prue or anything like that, but she knew that was a big part of my life, and she was interested in it. And so she started coming along to church, and she'd listen along with me to Dad explain some of these verses, and Prue came to faith. I'm very grateful that God blessed her with faith. She was baptised by Bishop David Coles on the same day that I was actually confirmed as well, so that was a lovely thing. And so there, I look back on that time and I see that where, my faith was becoming a bit stronger, but actually, by that stage, dance side of things was becoming a bit shakier because Southern Ballet was going down the tubes a little bit. It never had the funding that the Royal New Zealand Ballet had, so financially it was just not as big. And I'd come along with what was a newfangled idea that the dancers ought to be paid. These poor dancers who I worked with were not paid at all, and I thought that was appalling. So I was trying to work with various government schemes or something to give them some money. Because practically speaking, I could only ask the dancers to do something. I could say, could you please? They could say no to me and then just walk out the door. I had no control because they weren't paid. So, it would have been helpful for it to have been at least a semi-professional situation. Anyway, that was seen as boat rocking, and so they pulled the plug on the whole company rather than kind of go with the ideas that I was putting forth. And so the Southern Ballet Company at that point ceased to exist. So Prue and I were left a little stranded. Prue ended up taking a contract to dance with the Guangzhou Ballet in China, and I ended up taking another contract part-time with the Royal New Zealand Ballet because I didn't know what to do. And the director kept asking for me to go back, and I was a little bit, I'm kind of doing things here, but I had no work, so I would head back. And one of these times, when I said no to the director, I mentioned that I was seeing someone, and he said, who is it? And I said, it's this person called Prue. And it turns out that he had seen Prue dance before and in an audition situation. So he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll offer you both a contract. So you can both come up and together. So I rang Prue, who was in China, and said, I was very unromantic. I said, maybe you come back and we get married and we go, there was not that kind of guy. I did actually, when she arrived back, I welcomed her with one of these will you marry me signs, but actually we'd discussed it on the phone, so really she was jet lagged and terribly appreciative of the whole thing. It was not as romantic as it might have looked from the outside. But it was a fantastic opportunity to rejoin the ballet company, and this time, of course, I joined with my wife. and that was lovely. I couldn't partner Prue, unfortunately, in the ballet. She's a little bit too tall for me when she's on point, so the partnering that I'd done in Southern, I couldn't manufacture any other partners with partner as a dance for two people. I couldn't manufacture any more of that. I wasn't calling the shots anymore. So we went back to the ballet company, and the thing that I noticed really straight away with the ballet company was when I went back, I wasn't concerned at all about what roles I did. It just didn't interest me anymore. My time as a choreographer had got me a lot more interested in the art form and what it was doing than in actually what I was doing. I was more interested in the big picture. But that was when the roles started to come, when I went back straight away. And I'll start by just mentioning Peter Pan, actually, because Peter Pan is a very special ballet to me, and I'll show you a clip of it in a second. Russell Kerr and I, just before I went back to the ballet company, Martz, the director of the ballet company, had asked Russell and I to kind of co-choreograph new narrative work. Martz thought that I was kind of going to be the next narrative choreographer. There aren't many who do stories. Lots of choreographers do abstract ballets, but I was interested in stories. And so, as Martz saw it, he wanted to put the master, Russell, alongside with the apprentice, which is me. And so, while I was in Christchurch, I had these great sessions with Russell where I started working out the movements for Peter Pan, and he showed me all the notes he'd taken from the novel. He was such a genius. He'd take, character sketches and little notes about who they were, and he'd translate those into possible steps. By that stage, his body was getting older, and so he needed someone to try out what steps were possible. So I'd do a lot of that, and he'd say, okay, can Peter do this? And so we'd work together. And I was actually very disappointed in one way when I accepted the contract to dance, because that meant that I wouldn't get to finish this process with Russell. And so when I got up there, I was a bit sad about it, but it was lovely to start working for the first couple of days and see some of the movements that I'd come up with Russell and say, oh yeah, I know that. And I got very excited when Russell asked me to stand next to a guy called Cameron McMillan. Cameron was the principal dancer in the ballet company at that stage, clearly going to be Peter. But when he asked me to stand next to him, I knew where Russell was going. I thought, maybe that means I'm going to be the shadow. There's this part in Peter where the doppelganger of Peter does a little shadow dance. And so I got really, really excited. I thought maybe on the other cast I'm going to be the shadow. And then the casting sheet went up and he cast me as Peter. So he put me straight into the principal role, and I think Russell did that because he knew me. He had faith in me that the ballet company, the artistic director, didn't. But that was the start of quite a few principal roles for me. But Peter Pan has always had a special place kind of in my heart for that reason. I think I've got a short clip of it, which I'll play for you. Stop me talking. Oh, there's myself and my wife from a small clipping in the newspaper. This is a scene in the nursery. That's Mrs. Darling tucking the children away. Peter's lost his shadow by this stage, so he's about to come back looking for the shadow. Sorry about the grainy quality, but there weren't high definition cameras back then. This was a live performance. Tinkerbell's played by a girl called Miranda Glixon. I think you can just see Russell's genius for telling stories. Go and look for the shadow, we're looking for it. He just tells the story so well. So Tink finds it in the closet. Sticks it under the bed, so I get to shut it in the closet for a trouble. Now, under the bed, the shadow is lying there. He's holding on to this polystyrene rubber kind of shadow. extension of Peter himself, really. I was also remained interested in choreographing, and at that stage I would get to do other works as well. So Marks would regularly ask me to choreograph works for the ballet company at that stage. So things were going very well in the dance world. Probably still notable though that we were the only Christians, again still, Prue and I, so again no one else there of faith. And at times that proved challenging. There were some works that were hard. I remember particularly there was a work called Halo by a choreographer called Douglas Wright. Douglas Wright is one of the foremost contemporary choreographers in the country. And he had a background brought up in a Catholic school, which he remembered as very abusive. And so this work, Halo, was about his childhood in this Catholic institution and the bad experiences he'd had. And there was quite a bit of controversial stuff in Halo. I remember it was a little bit problematic for me with that one. So there was a lot of sexual material. There was a lot of blasphemous material. There was this scene of confession where a lot of us had to take a lot of our clothes off for some reason. And there was a recording of God's voice and people confessing, and then people saying really, really offensive sentences to God. And on the sexual side of things, there was one of the images which still sticks with me at the moment was this massive chair which had wings like an angel. Essentially, and this chair was faced, if you were the audience, the person was facing this way, the angels were back this way, and this person had a mechanism by which he pulled the lever which would flap the wings, and they did this to the sound of someone basically gratifying themselves sexually, and so the faster the angel wings went, and you get the picture, and that was problematic for me. And I remember the director at the time, Marks, who I'd built up a good relationship with by that stage, he came up to me and said, "Toby, are you all right with this?" He said, "You're a Christian, are you okay with this?" And I just said to him, I probably couldn't do that role there. I said, "I understand this is a work of artistic integrity," and I said, "I understand what this artist is saying. I respect Douglas an awful lot. So I am okay with it because I don't see this as a pure representation of the Christian faith. This was an abusive background, essentially, that this person was brought up with, and I respect the right for that. But you know, I still wonder to this day whether I might have been a little bit different in my response there, whether I was a little bit perhaps cowardly in engaging in some of the discussions that I think could have happened with that particular work. I think that was the challenge really I found in the company. You've got to be ready for the conversation. Often it would be in the dressing room when you're putting lipstick on, you know, someone would suddenly barrage you with questions about the Christian faith and things like that. But again, I found that all ended up strengthening my faith because I had to be able to answer some of these questions. I did want to sidetrack very briefly at this point because I raised the question before. I think it's odd why you don't see more Christians in dance. I did find it an odd question as I went through, and I don't have an answer for you tonight, but I do have some thoughts which I think apply when I'm considering, you know, why aren't there more Christians in the dance world. You think about composers like Bach, for example. You know, Bach was such an incredible composer and a wonderful ongoing testimony, I think, to God. And the art form of dance, I think, is hugely expressive. And so I see the potential for a lot of good with Christians in the dance world. But I'm a little bit puzzled sometimes as to why they're not there. But I think that I have a related thought, and one is something that Sir William Southgate said to me, actually. He said to me, while I was going to church with him one day, he said, "Toby, music is the only art form that hasn't been yet corrupted." He's talking about classical music there. Now, I thought about that for a while. I thought, what are you talking about there, Sir William? What are you talking about? But I get what he meant. And I'm not sure what I think about that today, but his point was fairly clear. Classical music, you kind of can't degrade it in a way that a lot of other art forms can. Things like painting and things like that, it's something that's visual, can often be turned to depict a lot darker material and that kind of thing in a way that classical music can't. And I already said that, you know, with dance, it's a very physical art form. And so there's a lot of temptations that go along with full-time dance that make it difficult, I think, to maintain faith in that environment. It's a very simple, practical thing, but I think it's a very real thing. So dance can be easily corrupted, I think, is my point. I don't mean scandalous sense of corruption here, but it can be turned to different purposes. More often than not, dance is about political statements these days, contemporary dance, or physicality and some darker, I guess, thematic material, because it lends itself to exploring that. Now, I am not going to say for a second that I think the Christian approach to dance should be that it should be evangelistic, or suddenly a dance should convert someone to faith, because I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think the aim for Christian art is to convert someone. I read a few writers on art and Christianity when I was preparing for this. One said, I must say emphatically, art must never be used to show the validity of Christianity. That artist later went on to qualify that, saying, well, that's not the primary purpose. But I agree with that. I don't think that art should be to show the validity of Christianity. But in that case, is there any difference between a non-Christian artist and a Christian artist? And one thing I found very helpful, I'm going to share it with you there, is some words by C.S. Lewis, actually. He wrote a book called The Great Divorce. I don't know if any of you have heard of The Great Divorce, but it's a fantastic, insightful piece of writing. C.S. Lewis, I think, had a wonderful ability to conceptualise things. Sometimes I think that when someone explains a subject in great detail, often I'm more confused by the end of their explanation than when I started. But C.S. Lewis takes some subject matter and he writes in a way that isn't really propositional and step by step, but he gives you this series of reflections, and at the end of it you kind of get what he's on about. Now, in The Great Divorce, it's really about a busload of people who are going from hell, basically, or purgatory, and they're taking a bus ride up to a heavenly country. So they're actually going up to heaven to have a look at this. And as they rise from hell, their bodies become somehow insubstantial. They become like mist or something like that. So they're not themselves. And when they arrive in heaven, they find that they can't actually live in that country. Their bodies aren't prepared for it. Because they're insubstantial, they can't lift a leaf, or various things like that. And while they're there, they encounter these shining beings in heaven who have various conversations with them, and they're trying to talk about life. Now, one of the conversations between the ghosts, which are from down here, and the spirits, is about art. And one of the ghosts who comes down from hell or purgatory is an artist who wants to paint this incredible country. And the spirit says to him, well, if you're interested in the country only for the sake of painting it, you'll never learn to see the country. And the ghost says, but that's just how a real artist is interested in the country. No, you're forgetting, said the spirit. That was not how you began as an artist. Light itself was your first love. You loved paint only as a means of telling about light. Oh, that was ages ago, said the ghost. One grows out of that. Of course, you haven't seen my later works. One becomes more and more interested in paint for its own sake. One does indeed. I also have had to recover from that. This is the spirit now. It was all a snare. Ink and catgut and paint were necessary down there, but they're also dangerous stimulants. Every poet and musician and artist, but for grace, is drawn away from love of the thing he tells to love of the telling. I won't go any further, but I wonder if you see the point here that they're saying, which is that it's not the interest, if you like, in art for art's sake. So what C.S. Lewis was saying essentially was, as a Christian artist, we know why we create art, and we never lose sight of that just to create the art. You never become more interested in the paint for the sake of itself. And I think that shows great insight. I love the phrase that he uses there, dangerous stimulants, because I think that refers to some of the things that I've been speaking about tonight, that certainly drew me away from my faith at times within the dance world. And perhaps that's something to do with why we don't see more Christians, perhaps, in the dance world. And it's a shame. It's a great shame, because I think that dance is immensely powerful, potentially immensely powerful. This is a beautiful work that I took part in called Soldateness, which is called Field Mass. It's essentially a tribute to the unknown soldier by a Czechoslovakian choreographer called Yuri Kilian. And it was one of the most beautiful works I've ever seen. And the power of that work was extraordinary. It was about the wastage of war. And I remember there's a point towards the end. There's 16 men in this piece dressed in fatigues like that. They're all on stage the whole time. And at the end, you have been going for about 25 minutes, so you're nearly physically sick, and you're performing this wave after wave of movements, which is symbolic of war, and then you're told to stand up and you have to sing this war anthem. And the effect is extraordinary because you can't sing. You've got no breath left. But that's exactly what the choreographer intended. And so you have this group of men, with broken voices trying to, show their solidarity and their courage and that kind of thing, but you can't because you're broken. And, simple things like that. The ability of dance to convey an idea or something beautiful or powerful is extraordinary. And so I personally would love to see more Christians not doing evangelistic works, but creating art that keeps in view the whole beauty of God's creation. The whole of the truth, if you like, that don't lose their sense of the light. I didn't want to, I've gone a little longer than I was thinking of, and I've got a little bit left to say. I was going to say something on liturgical dance because I'm often asked, particularly when I went through full-time training at college, what my thoughts were on liturgical dance. I have never done it myself, which might give you an idea of the preference that I have. I've never taken part in it. But I don't like general rules that will say never do this or, never do that. A couple of thoughts that I have. I would be interested in, using dance as an expressive form within church, but perhaps not to do something that something else is better suited for. So if preaching, for example, is a way of explaining God's word, I don't think that liturgical dance is going to explain that better than preaching can, so I probably wouldn't use dance to do that. But dance can evoke emotion. I think that one legitimate use of it might be to use in a choral setting or something like that, some simple gestural movements or group body movements to kind of punctuate a choral production. I think that would work, but you'd probably have some difficulty with the choir members and things like that in terms of moving them and things. But I see some potential there. And I never say never. I think I haven't yet been in charge of parish or something like that, so it wouldn't surprise me if I was thinking about how to do something in a parish if dance just cropped up on my radar as a particular way or a potential way to do something. Like I say never. But I do think that, I don't know about you, but I've certainly seen some examples of liturgical dance which has certainly put me off. I've seen some people doing it, and there are certain ways which I don't think it should be done because I don't think it's necessarily honouring or correct in its purpose. Anyway, I won't say more about that. Just a couple more bits. Prue and I, just a couple more things about life on the road. So Prue and I in the company, there was a documentary which TVNZ did back in 2001, which I've got a couple of tiny clips for you which illustrate life on the road.
Company and the South Island Road Tour has already made the mighty West Coast.
2001.
Living out of motels can be pretty tiring, but at least if you're married like Prue and Toby, you don't have to leave the family at home.
We just got one key, haven't we? It's an odd kind of job sometimes because it seems to matter so much to you. You're not, as a dancer, you're never happy with your performance on stage, and then your partner's going to have to put up with that, I'll ask Prue what she thought of the show, she'll say terrible. She'll come up to me and say, "Land sweet, well, I said, no, I didn't, it was shocking." And we're always so harsh on either ourselves or our own performance.
Prue and Toby got a motel room with an oven, but that isn't going to help them much.
Baked beans in the cupboard at the moment, so we've got. We've actually missed the supermarket run.
Yeah, we've got baked beans and a can of anchovies.
There's not much you can cook with that. Really.
And there was, on this particular tour, I'd also choreographed a work called Lounge Suite. The Smalls tour was always my favourite, the one that went to different towns, because you met such wonderful people. I love taking the time to speak to them afterwards. And the reason I liked this documentary so much was that it didn't focus on the dancers so much. They did one in the ballet company a few years ago called The Secret Lives of Dancers, I think, or something like that, which was a little bit more like tabloid stuff. It followed the relationships. This spoke to the people on the tour, which I really liked. So there's something of one of these gentlemen and a little bit of the work.
I've never been to ballet. It's one of the things I've missed out on in life, and I thought I'd enjoy catching up with it, and hopefully I'll find somebody that explains to me what it's supposed to be telling me. I'm getting flashed up because I bought this about 5 years ago to go on a cruise. We never went on the cruise, and I wanted to die without having worn it.
I don't think I've been to the ballet before, so it might be a new experience. I mean, fancy waiting this long to get this grey hair before you go to the ballet. It's a bit silly, really, isn't it?
This is the ballet I choreographed.
I really think of it like a whole lot of weird little characters dancing under the moonlight in France or something. Comedy is really difficult, I think. You can really easily cross the line into bad, hammy slapstick. So I told them to not try to be funny, but just try and be zany, to make their character live in an odd little world.
Downstairs, the company's new Chinese import, Jean Gore, who the dancers have nicknamed Bruce, is relaxed and ready. This is Jean Gore's first night. Her character is the noble suitor Jean de Brie.
Yes, so we continued on our time in the ballet company there, and that was really marked by a few things, as well as the choreography. I was getting more interested in management actually as well. I think at that stage I was thinking, gee, I'd actually quite like to go on and maybe direct the ballet company one day. And so I started to study towards it. I thought I didn't want to be an artistic director who only knew dance. I wanted to understand the business side of things. So I started doing a Bachelor of Business through the Open Polytech. And I got some funding to do that. So I'd often be doing papers while I was on the road and on tour. And I got halfway through that. I'm surprised I got that far through it actually. But that was terrific though. It really helped me think about it, and I had a lot of conversations with the artistic director at the time, with Martz, and I got very close with him. He'd talk through decisions, he'd ask me about my studies and how that impacted, and we thought a lot together about the ramifications for thinking from a business mind, about creativity and the synergies that were there too. So that was a really good time. And I think at that stage, my daughter was born, our daughter was born, and so it really spelled the end of our time in the ballet company there, because you're on the road 50% of the time. So I did give it 1 year to see if it was worth staying in the ballet company or not. But after the year, I became very clear very quickly that I couldn't spend that much time away from Prue and Twyla. So I left, we went back to Christchurch and started doing other things. I was telling you earlier I did work in a call centre. That's simply because after you've been in the ballet company, no one wants to employ you. If you say that you've been a dancer, you look at your CV, no one's interested at all because you've got nothing to offer, or so they think. So I put my CV into heaps of places looking for jobs and none of them would talk to me. The only company that did talk to me was Telecom, and I was desperate by that stage, so I took a job in a call centre for 18 months. When you get in a taxi and you tell them that you work for Telecom as opposed to the Royal New Zealand Ballet, I do notice the difference. The conversation suddenly drops dead. But from there I moved into more of a conflict resolution part, then I moved into an IT kind of area, and then from there into programming, believe it or not. I started doing some programming and things too. So I moved out of that space and into the tech space, and started thinking too about ministry. I'll say something more about that in a second, but just this photo first of all. This is Russell Kerr on the right hand side. So as I was doing these other jobs, occasionally I'd be asked to stage things for the Royal New Zealand Ballet, or maybe choreograph as well. This is when I first staged Peter Pan. I went back, so I retired full-time by this stage. Russell on the right-hand side couldn't again demonstrate too much, so I would actually teach the ballet to the choreographers. This is Philip Norman, the composer from Christchurch, and I still remember him and Russell coming up with the themes for the ballet, and Gary Harris was the artistic director at that time as well. So that ballet stayed very dear to me, but at that stage too I was thinking about ministry full-time, but although I was thinking about it, I had two major obstacles, if you like. Number one, I'd grown up with Dad and I thought there's just no way that I can do what you do. I don't have the patience, I don't have the caring, I can't do what you did. I didn't think I was good enough. The other thing is that I felt like, well, maybe I'm just following in the family footsteps, because by that stage my brother was an ordained minister, and so I thought I might be doing it for the wrong reasons. I just had those obstacles. So I carried on doing the tech work, the IT work, and the occasional ballet things. I didn't really consider ministry very much. But certainly, faith-wise, my life was strong there at that stage, and I really felt that that was in the right place, faith-wise. While we were in church, we were learning, we were growing, and that felt in a really good place. But it felt like the dance side was probably dying a natural death, to be honest. I did apply for the artistic directorship once. That was after Gary left, which was a year after this. I made the shortlist. I think, as I understand it, I made it to the top of the national candidates, but they appointed an international director. But I felt very clearly that because I'd moved away from Christchurch, I was just stepping back further and further away from that world. And as time went on, and the dancers who I knew in the company kind of turned over, I think those relationships, well, it was never going to be the same. It became clear to me. But at the same time, I think that God was working in my heart to overcome those objections that I had as well. And I remember realising very clearly after a number of years that God doesn't wait until someone's good enough before you can be qualified to be in ministry. That's not how God works. You know, God was happy, I knew, to accept me the way that I was. It wasn't a case of becoming a better person first. And realising that God would meet me in my weaknesses was a huge thing for me as well. And also I just was able to answer the question too, that no, I didn't want to be in ministry because it was the family business. I felt called to be in ministry. So we went up to Auckland, to St John's, and I finally put an end to the various little things that I was doing, and I'll skip through these. That's me rehearsing Peter Pan. Also, a couple of photos of Pinocchio, which was a full-length work I choreographed in 2013. That was the last work I did for the ballet company. And yeah, just some of these shots. Incidentally, that's Jiminy Cricket. I got a hard time from one of the critics in particular because I killed off the cricket very early on, and they said, well, that's not right, that's not Pinocchio. Actually, that's the story. In the story, the cricket dies. But I did make a slight concession because Pinocchio needed a moral voice. So as the cricket was mashed and thrown into that fire, I came up with this idea of a lamppost who was on stilts and a lot taller. She's way in the background there. Who simply had, right and wrong, and would often point Pinocchio in the moral direction that he ought to go. So that was my kind of concession. You had to characters like the cat and the fox here. So I stayed very true to the original fairy tale, which was very dark in places. And Julian Southgate was the designer for he's a wonderful designer from Christchurch, who's amazing costumes and things. Yeah, these guys were taller, and I loved what Julian did here. This was a dark scene. I don't know if you know the story of Pinocchio, but he's taken with all these boys to a land where they gradually turn into donkeys. It's a bit sinister. He doesn't realise that's what's going on. There's this really cheerful looking thing there. So I worked with Julian. We had this really creepy idea. Or Julian did, this guy's face comes off and it's just a wooden ball underneath, and he's just this faceless kind of awful thing. Most Pinocchio's friends get turned into donkeys and die. We also had to figure out, given that it was Smalls Tour and you can't fly scenery in any of the venues, how we were going to come up with a big fish. I love Julian's simple idea of putting something, the dancers worked it themselves, but it looked really, really effective. And the opening image I had of Pinocchio in my mind when I was trying to conceive it was when Pinocchio's in Geppetto's stomach. Geppetto is in the stomach of the whale and Pinocchio is swallowed by the fish. And that came very close to being what I thought. And that was just a shot from the distance where they meet inside the whale and they haven't seen each other since the beginning of the ballet. So it's a lovely moment, I thought, and that's one of his friends turned into a donkey and died in the Blue Fairy. But yeah, and I think the last thing I wanted to say about faith, I must finish now, but the last objection I had about faith not being able to hold up, I started doing what's called the Tim course, and that's why I say there how Tim helped me. There was a Bible teaching course in Christchurch, something my dad set up, and you got to take the opportunity to really learn how to teach the Bible to other people. What happened with me was I just had to end up reading and studying it an awful lot more than I had done up until that point. And that was where God answered my prayers in the most glorious way that I didn't even know I was asking. But I needed to know that my faith held up. And when I read the Bible solidly through, and as I studied it, and as I really looked into it, I just suddenly became convicted there is no way that this work could be anything other than divine. It was that simple for me. I realised that it couldn't possibly fit together the way that it does. It couldn't, stand up to the scrutiny that I was giving it, real, honest, intellectual scrutiny. And I thought there's just no way that this could stand up by a human author. So that was very instrumental in setting me on the road to St John's. And St John's was a wonderful time. That was we only got back from St John's at the beginning of this year. That was 3 years training for the ministry, and I won't bore. That's another speech which I won't bore you with the time there. But it was a great time when I was exposed to other styles of church and that kind of thing. And I only had one experience of church in my life, and certainly the big question for me when I first got up to St John's was, well, who's right and who's wrong? There's all these people saying different things. Who's right and who's wrong? But as time went on, that question became slightly different. It turned into where are the boundaries? So from who's right and who's wrong to where are the boundaries? And then by my third year, I was really asking the question, how does it all fit together? And that's, to me, more indicative of the way I think about those kinds of things. Now, how does it fit together? There are questions to be answered with that, but I think that's much better and more healthy than the who's right and who's wrong, who's in, who's out kind of thing. Of course, I was saying no to every dance thing, and that did leave me sometimes with a question, was it all a waste of time? I spent the better part of my years dancing, and so in terms of dance and faith, was it a waste of time to do all that dance? Well, the simple answer is no. I read something by a fellow called Peter Adam not long ago. He's a Christian writer. He wrote these words, which I think are lovely. God is such a good housekeeper that nothing is wasted in his economy. No prayer, no sacrifice, no gift, no godliness, no good work, no love, kindness, generosity, care. God uses all these for his glory and for his good purposes. And I think of thinking about God as such a good housekeeper, nothing wasted in his economy. I think the answer is clearly no. Not at all. That dance, my time with dance made me who I am. It gives me the ability to think of the big picture. I'm sure that there will be times in my ministry where I'll be calling on it. Probably not in a strictly liturgical dance setting, but there are times when you can say something in dance. And in an odd kind of way, that's what I'm going to finish with, the last little snippet I'm going to give you, which in a weird way I felt was very appropriate, was what I used to say goodbye to the students of St John's. For some weird reason, they had the valedictory speech giving, final assembly while I was having an exam. Just, they scheduled it, so I couldn't be there at all. And normally they give you a couple of minutes to say something. And I felt like I wanted to say something, but I couldn't, so I recorded something for them. Here's what I shared with them at the end. Hi guys, sorry, I'm just in the middle of an exam at the moment, writing an essay on being in the image of God. But thanks very much for letting me beam in to the Wesley here and just say a couple of words about how grateful I am for my time at St John's. It's hard to know where to start, really. I really feel like I've achieved a lot in the time since I've been here. But rather than think about the big things, sometimes I just think about the little things I've achieved. Like, for some reason it sticks in my mind that I have managed to go 3 years without acceding to the requests from various people for doing some form of interpretive dance. They've asked me over the years, but I'm actually proud of the fact that I've managed to say no.
But you know what? I actually can't think of a better way to sum up my time here at St. John's. So, here is something deep, something intense, something very artistic. This is my time at St. John's in a duet dance.
Toby's also the assistant at All Souls Merivale, which is the new incarnation of what used to be St Mary's Merivale. If you go to the press online, you'll see about the open day they've just had. The church looks like a satellite about to be fired into space. It also incorporates what used to be St Matthew's St Albans. And the vivacious young woman who is your vicar, I in fact married her and her husband at St Mary's Addington quite a few years ago. She begins the main service on Sunday morning at All Souls with, "Good morning, church." I promise to never do this here. Now take a few questions.
Sure. I've probably covered everything, but I'm happy if there are any questions to answer any at all.
You won't ever lose that vitality.
Well, I hope not.
No.
Yeah, I hope not. I'm hoping that there's a chance, to do some things creatively in the future, and I look to do that. I like to take the chance. I think that's my kind of nod to that. But thank you. I hope I don't. Yeah.
I think done appropriately, it would be fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I have to say I was borderline uncomfortable with what we're doing in the chapel there, but I think it was born with good grace by the students of Theological College, and there was no dishonour intended. Those who know me know that I would never dishonour anything like that, so yeah.
It's a very special place, that chapel, isn't it? I mean, it's,
Lovely chapel.
for me, it's there's the ghost of Selwyn's there.
Yeah.
And many of the Hatfield, one of the foundation figures of the Anglican Church in this country.
Yeah.
It's alive with the spirit of those who came before. And
Yeah.
it's a beautiful place.
Yeah.
It's full of God's spirit and His presence.
Yeah, when you sit there, you really do. You're in mind. You're put in mind with those who've gone before. You really are. It's a lovely place.
Bishop Simkin, the Bishop of Falkland, just after the war, shrewdly got himself buried just outside the chapel.
Yes, he did.
Pull that off.
Yeah. I met his wife actually in a retirement village. And actually, on a sad note too, I was going to say too, I mentioned to Hugh, I took my first funeral a week ago. It was actually Russell Kerr's wife, which was very meaningful for me. Russell phoned me up and said that she'd just died. I'd visited him a few times this year, but he asked me to take the service, which was lovely. And I just think a very special way, again, for faith and dance to meet like that. It was, lovely.
Well, Toby, rarely have we had such disarming candor from our speakers about their biography, but also very entertaining and very much to the point about crucial issues in our culture and our society. And I was saying to you before, I told a friend recently that I would forget to give up being a wordsmith and being an intellectual to be physically graceful and dance. So you have what I wish I'd been given. The gift had been given out. So that's what will happen, of course. Thank you very much for coming.
Bada bing, bada boom, la la la, boom, she, boom,